Good evening and welcome to our presentation. I'm part of the Arts and Culture Council, which is a volunteer arm of the library. We curate art exhibits and assist in programming a variety of arts and cultural presentations. Before I introduce our speaker tonight, I want to make mention of a couple of things. On March the 30th, we will have another presentation, this time by Lee Bartell, PhD Professor Emeritus from U of T and founding director of the Music and Health Research Collaboratory at the Faculty of Music at the University of Toronto. And his topic is blood, bone, and brains. And as Hannah mentioned, keeping in touch with the library through their email and newsletters is a good way to be aware of any of the art shows that, of course, right now are all virtual. And also being aware of any of the shows coming up that you might be interested in viewing or being a part of. So now it's my pleasure to introduce our speaker for tonight. Michael Arkless is not really anybody that needs to be introduced, as he has spoken for the library before, and people know his photography for sure. So we're happy to have Michael with us tonight to talk about Nepal and India, a visit to the cradle of civilization. Mike has been a successful photographer for over 40 years and has been involved in international exhibitions and has won in some of those exhibitions for sure. Gillian and Mike have been coming up here for about 15 years after immigrating from the UK about 20 years ago. And for the last 6 years, they've been residents here in the Beaver Valley. And since Michael retired from his job as in the energy industry as the CFO of a major multinational company. They have traveled extensively. Both Michael and Gillian have enjoyed many trips, and they remember the 2017 trip to India as one of their most memorable and exciting. So Michael's going to share that tonight. And like all of us, I know they're looking forward, once this COVID thing is over, to attacking the bucket list and traveling to many different locations. So Mike, I'll turn it over to you, and we're looking forward to your presentation.
Thank you for that introduction, Helen. Let me just start sharing the screen. And also thank you, Hannah, for your work in setting this up tonight, sorting out the technology and getting the invitations out so that folks can attend. So let's start. India is a vast, diverse country, and it's home to over 1 billion people and boasts a rich cultural history. A visit to the cradle of humanity. Now, where does that title come from? Well, I must confess, I've actually borrowed from a famous writer, Mark Twain. Mark Twain wrote, "India is the cradle of the human race, the birthplace of human speech, the mother of history, the grandmother of legend, and the great-grandmother of tradition. Our most valuable and most instructive materials in the history of man are treasured up in India only." Now, Mark Twain wrote that after his visit to India in 1897, and the sentiment he expressed then, I think, still holds true 120 years later. And hopefully I can show you why I believe that to be true in the next 60 minutes or so. Let's just get rid of that, sorry. So our tour began in February 2007, as Helen mentioned, with a flight from Toronto to Delhi. That's a flight, if you go non-stop at least, of around 15 hours, just under 15 hours from Toronto to Delhi. And we flew by Air Canada. So they have a direct flight, or certainly did at that stage, to Delhi. And as you can imagine, that's an awful long way and an awful long time to spend in an aeroplane, but well worth the effort. This map highlights the key destinations, and I'll follow through the order that you see here on the screen, so 1 through 7. Destination, or I should say the Delhi itself, was really very much a hub for the trip. And the adjacent trips that we took to Kathmandu in Nepal and also to Darjeeling in the very eastern part of India were both made from New Delhi. So direct flights from Delhi into Kathmandu and via Calcutta into Darjeeling. Many of you have heard of India's Golden Triangle. It's a tourist circuit which connects the national capital of Delhi, which is number 1, to Agra, which shows as number 3 on this diagram, and then back to Jaipur, which is number 5 on the map. So that small triangle between 1, 3, and 5 is the Golden Triangle. And my recommendation to anyone who's planning to visit India is to think very much beyond the triangle. I think you leave yourselves very short if that's where your only focus is. I understand the attraction of those areas, absolutely, but there is so much beyond those 3 areas. Those of you who are interested in our travel experience, we traveled using a company called Explore India. They're part of the Cruise Connections group and based out of Vancouver. And I have to say, they were very, very diligent, both onshore in Canada and on the ground in India in providing the support that we needed. We traveled as a relatively small group, 20 in the main group, and that main group visited destinations 1 through 5. Then there were half a dozen or 6 of us who visited Nepal, and then Gillian and I traveled alone to Darjeeling. So relatively small group, and that worked out very well for us. So let's start with Delhi. Old Delhi was once the capital of Islamic India and contrasts sharply with New Delhi, which was created by the British Raj in the 1930s. Delhi itself as a city is the 2nd largest in India, with a population of roughly 12 million, Mumbai being the largest. The metropolitan area of Delhi, however, which is otherwise known as the Central National Capital Region, is home to almost 30 million people. So getting on for the size of Canada in the extended metropolitan area. Our first visit, or our first attraction, was the Rajghat, which is the site of Mahatma Gandhi's final journey. He was assassinated here in 1948. And as many of you will know, Gandhi was considered the father of the nation. He led the movement for independence, which ultimately led to the end of colonialism. We visited the Gandhi National Museum, and there we saw his spectacles. Now, these spectacles hit the headlines back in 2009. An undisclosed buyer, who presumably gifted them to the National Museum, or the Gandhi National Museum, purchased a variety of items belonging to Gandhi, including the spectacles and the sandals, for the sum of 2 million Canadian dollars. So these are one very expensive pair of spectacles. They're made from metal, and they were preserved in the original case. Gandhi originally purchased the spectacles at the end of the 19th century. As part of the museum, there was also a reconstruction of the actual living space that he lived in. And as you can see, it's very austere. The spectacles, Gandhi said, once proclaimed that these spectacles gave him the vision to free India. And as I mentioned, lots of memorabilia on the site. You could literally spend 2 or 3 hours comfortably and really just scratch the surface. And those exhibits are both indoors and outdoors. Our next step in Delhi is the Qutub Minar. This is a UNESCO World Heritage Monument, part of the Maroli Archaeological Park, which is the one-time center of the Delhi Sultanate. This is the highest single tower in India, marked the site of the first Muslim kingdom established in India in 1193. You can't quite see it on this photograph, but it's 5 levels high, and it's made from a mixture of sandstone and marble. And if you look at the 4th level, which is the one toward the top of the screen, you'll see the kind of white circle there. That's the marble element of the structure. The structure itself stands just over 70 meters tall. There are 380 stairs, or 379 stairs inside the tower, which lead to the top. And just to give you a sense of scale, 14 meters wide at the bottom and 3 meters wide at the top. Now, back in time, it was possible for the general public to go inside the tower and actually climb to the very top. Unfortunately, in 1981, there was an electricity failure in Delhi, and that's not at all uncommon. Anyone who's been to India will be familiar with the power cuts. And in 1981, there was a power failure in Delhi. And as a result of that, 45 people were killed in a stampede to come down those stairs inside the tower. And as a result of that accident, that disaster, public access to the inside of the tower is now prohibited. The park itself is home to many pavilions, tombs, and mosques with ornate carvings and inscription in the sandstone. And you can see some of them here. And it's amazing how these have stood the test of time. Remember, we're looking here at carvings which extend back as far as 900 years. Really quite elaborate, very, very fine. And this is sandstone that these carvings are inscribed in. Now, Delhi is a very busy place. As I mentioned, extended population of close to 30 million. Just to provide some perspective, India itself is roughly 1/3 the size of Canada, just over 3 million square kilometers in India, 10 million square kilometers in Canada. Yet India has a population of 1.3 billion. Canada's population is roughly 3% of that number. So on a density basis, India is 100 times that of Canada. So you'll see lots and lots of people in India. Wherever you go, you see lots of people. This photograph was taken at the Jama Masjid, which is the largest mosque in India. Many of these people are tourists, but they're Indian tourists. They're not tourists from other parts of the world. Generally speaking, there are very few tourists from the Western world who attend or who go to India. Most of the tourism here is homegrown, so to speak. And you'll see an awful lot of folks there. There's a lot of begging takes place in the streets, and we were faced with this almost on a day-by-day basis. We saw a lot of this in India, and we saw a lot of colourful characters in India. A lot of people sitting around, an awful lot of waiting in India, it seems to me. People have time to talk, time to contemplate. Now, as I mentioned, this is the largest mosque in India. It was built or completed in 1656. It took roughly 5,000 workers to construct the mosque, and it took 6 years to build. You see the speakers on the minaret, just on the left-hand side of the photographs here. These are used to broadcast the adhan. The adhan is the call to the Muslim prayer, and that's broadcast 5 times a day. Wherever you are in Delhi, you can hear the speakers playing. You can hear the call to prayer, and it's kind of part of the rhythm of the city. It's with you all the time. You can get a sense here of the architecture again, sandstone and marble, and frieze work there on the railing beside the gentleman in the pink costume. And then a lot of gilt work across the ceiling itself. Very, very elaborate, very, very grand buildings. We also visited Hamian's tomb. This is the first example of a Murgal garden tomb. And it was very much the basis for, or the inspiration for later monuments elsewhere within India, including the Taj Mahal itself. And obviously we'll see that later on. As you can probably see, The building is perfectly symmetrical. Again, sandstone, marble composite, and adorned by fine stone trellis work, which you can see in the doorway here. The tomb was commissioned by Hamian's first wife, Haji Begum, back in 1558, and designed by a father and son team from Persia. It's the first garden tomb on the Indian subcontinent, and the tomb has been declared as a UNESCO World Heritage Site. And that happened in 1993, and the tomb, the complex, has undergone significant restoration work since then, and that's now largely complete. And you'll see many of these caskets around the site, and these are for relatives of Hamian. It seems he had a very large family, and there are lots of these tombs around the entirety of the site. Inside the buildings themselves, you'll see these fine marble ceilings with inlays. And again, very, very ornate and symmetrical structures inside those buildings. Very, very beautiful. You get a sense from the floor of the kind of sheen on the floor of the number of people who pass this way. I mean, these are very, very busy sites. And also very beautiful. Now, you can't go too far in India without seeing elephants and camels, and sometimes you see them in the most surprising places. So we were traveling between sites in our coach, and was just about to drive over a bridge crossing a river, and we sighted these animals literally on wasteland at the side of the river, on the river bank. A pretty rundown kind of shanty tent enclosure. These animals are used for a number of purposes. They're used as working animals, clearly, but they're also used and rented out for weddings, for carnivals, for birthday parties. The elephant itself as an animal is worshipped in India and is seen to represent Lord Ganesha, who's the patron of intellectuals, bankers, and writers. And apparently it shows off wealth by using these animals in celebrations and as a way to honor the Hindu deity. I should hasten to add, these animals were probably living here illegally. Their owners would probably have bribed officials to allow them to keep them on the land which they wouldn't own. I have to say, they were fairly sorry-looking beasts, and you can see these camels tethered by concrete blocks. The elephants themselves were chained, which is really quite sad. We enjoy touring the streets of Delhi and wandering through the souks, the bazaars. Clearly, a lot of different fruit, different vegetation for the locals to buy and to eat. Very, very colourful. An interesting place to spend a few hours. Now, anyone who's been to India will be more than familiar with the tuk-tuk. These small vehicles are really the lifeblood for many of the larger cities within India, and they ferry folks around. You can get 3 or 4 people inside these little 2-stroke powered tricycles. You notice anyone who's been to India recently will notice that these vehicles are now generally colored green and yellow, specifically in Delhi. And that signifies that these are environmentally friendly tuk-tuks. Despite being 2-stroke, they're powered by either CNG, as is the case, compressed natural gas, which this one here is, or liquid natural gas. The more traditional petrol tuk-tuks, which are very, very smelly, very noisy, are generally painted black and yellow. So If you want to be environmentally friendly as you're wandering around Delhi, you should be looking out for a green taxi rather than a black one. Now, as well as Old Delhi, we also see lots of wide avenues, grand vistas within the New Delhi area itself. This is the Parliament building, and you can obviously see it's a very different type of building, much more modern, and you can see the palatial boulevards and the parkland setting surrounding it. In truth, we spent very little time in New Delhi. Most of our time was spent in Old Delhi itself. This is Old Delhi, and you can see, the sheer volume of people. And this is very late at night. This is probably 7 o'clock, 8 o'clock at night, and the streets were absolutely alive with people. You get a sense of the infrastructure. Just look at the telephone cables, the power cables straddled across the street. They're really quite amazing. This is a telephone junction box, I guess. India is an amazing place from a telephone perspective. The telecommunication network in India is probably the second largest in the world. If you look at the number of telephone subscribers, they have over 1.2 billion telephone subscribers. That's mobile and fixed line, as at the end of 2020. It enjoys probably the lowest call tariff in the world. They have massive telephone or telecom operators in India, and there's lots and lots of competition amongst them. You can't turn the TV on in India without seeing an advert for 2 or 3 different mobile telephone providers. It is very much a big part of the infrastructure. Telephony alone is responsible for probably close to 10% of the GDP in India. It's a massive, massive industry. The internet base, again, a massive internet base with probably 700 million or more broadband internet subscribers in India. And if you think about how India operates as a country, the outsourcing operations, the call center operations, they're all predicated on having this strong telephony infrastructure. The other thing you'll see in Delhi, and you'll experience, and I kind of mentioned it before, was the power situation. Power outages in Delhi are common, they're common throughout India. And quite frankly, the generation assets are not sufficient to meet the demand, particularly in the summer months when air conditioning is called for. As everyone switches on the air conditioning, typically the load multiplies by a factor of up to 4 or 5, and they have brownouts, constant brownouts in Delhi. So all of those organizations that run call centers or outsource operations to India are relying on backup power generation. In all cases, there'll be 2 sets of backup because it's just a matter of fact that the power will outage at least once a day, and in many cases, much more, or many more times than that. The other thing this photograph highlights is the rhesus macaque, a monkey, and they run amok throughout Delhi. Nowhere is out of bounds. They've even run through the Parliament building, causing mayhem. They steal food, they attack people, and they steal mobile phones. Well, there are plenty of mobile phones to be stolen, but these guys like stealing mobile phones. The government have attempted to deal with the issue by introducing a sterilization program for the monkey population, but that apparently has failed. And I guess I can understand, if I was a monkey, it's exacerbated their aggression. They're even more aggressive now that we've tried to sterilize them. So go figure. So from New Delhi, or Delhi, our next journey took us to Varanasi. We flew to Varanasi, which is the religious capital of Hinduism in India, in the state of Uttar Pradesh. And I have to say, this part of the journey was the experience which will always remain in my memory. It was absolutely fascinating and very, very unexpected. This is one of the most ancient cultures in India. It's the oldest living city in India, and it's home to one of the most time-honored and mysterious cultures, which date back well over 5,000 years. Its name is derived from the fact that the city is at the confluence of the rivers of Varuna and Asi. although its fame derives primarily from its location on the banks of the river Ganges. The river Ganges is almost 2,500 kilometers long. It rises in the Himalayas to the north of India and ultimately disgorges into the Bay of Bengal to the south. And it's a sacred river for the Hindu population. Varanasi is home to 1.2 million residents, but the constant stream of visitors means that at any point in time, the number of residents is much, much higher than that number. Our first visit to Varanasi and the Ganges specifically took place in the evening. And the first thing you see when you get on the river are these buildings, these structures, the steps leading from the river up to the tenement buildings above. And these are referred to as ghats. The city of Varanasi has 88 ghats, and these extend along the river throughout the city of Varanasi. Most of these were constructed in the 18th century under the patronage of various Maratha rulers. And you can see these are very, very colourful areas and attract a lot of attention. A lot of people come down to spend the evening by the river. And there's a lot of activity going on, children playing board games, people reading, people walking, people consuming food and the like. You saw these young boys before just kind of hanging out here at this upturned boat. Again, very, very colourful. This ghat is one of the most religiously significant ghats on the Ganges in Varanasi. It's a holy cremation ground, and it sits amongst the sacred, or sits by the sacred riverfront. In Hinduism, death is considered a gateway to another life, and it's marked by the result of one's karma. Fundamentally, it's believed that a dead human soul attains moksha and breaks the cycle of rebirth when they're cremated here, specifically in Manakanika. As a result of that, many elderly people from across the entirety of India seek to walk up to the edge of the river at the ghat and spend their last days, their last hours absorbing the ghat and the serenity that comes from being beside the river. This, I have to say, was completely unexpected. The sight, the sights, the smell, the sound for us as we drifted down the river were really quite moving. Over 40,000 cremations a year are performed along this area of the river, and mostly on wood pyres. And you can see the kind of wood piles here. Everywhere you see flames, there's a body burning. Those who can't afford to have a cremation here, a traditional funeral, simply place their bodies in the Ganges, and they're kind of consumed by the river as bodies. The cremation ghat, as I said, is really a tremendously auspicious place to be cremated. And it was built by Lord Vishnu, this specific ghat. Cremation happens very shortly after death. The eldest son is responsible for making all the arrangements. And you may have seen from the earlier photographs, no women at all are allowed on the site. These are only men present on the site. The body is dipped in the Ganges after it dries. The wood's purchased and arranged, and the body is placed on it for burning. And that process can take up to 6 hours. Further down the river, in the gathering darkness, we partook in the devotional ceremony of Aarti, and that's performed by thousands of devoted Hindus. The chanted prayers and the drumming and the bells from the temple were really tremendously moving. And you can just imagine this almost surreal experience floating in the river Ganges with the noise and the lights and the kind of sense of the people all around us. It was really quite something. After experiencing the arty for, I don't know, 45 minutes, an hour or so, we slowly drifted back to where we'd entered the river. And as you can see at this stage, we really are in complete darkness, but there are still boats plying their trade along the river. Indeed, many of the local fishermen, the local workers actually live and sleep on the area immediately beside the river. These folks would be here all night and then would work again in the morning. So we came back the following morning and took in the sunrise. We took a boat ride on the Ganges and saw the sun come up. And as you can see, even at that stage, there were many, many people gathering, coming out in their boats again, either to pray or to just simply enjoy the experience of the sunrise. Yoga practitioner on one of the ghats. Lots of colour, lots of characters, and obviously folks bathing, either by themselves or, as I'll show in a moment, as part of a group. Laundry wallers in the river, washing their clothes. Now, I think as I mentioned earlier, in some cases the bodies are simply placed in the river. In other cases, the ashes are placed in the river after the cremation takes place. So, I think to our eyes, at least, this is a kind of slightly surreal experience to see folks washing their clothes in this kind of environment. And you'll see there the bed sheets laid out to dry after they've been washed. This is a kind of a multiple bathing ceremony happening here. Again, you just can't be attracted by the colour and by the nature of the activity. And it's for all ages. Here you have an entire family, kind of grandmother, mother, and young daughter, all taking part in the bathing ceremony. You see lots of vendors, typically young girls, handing out or selling marigolds. Marigolds are flowers for the dead. There's a belief that the scent of the marigold will help souls reach to the altar, sold to worshippers, and they're offered to the gods each day. And you'll see many of these floating on the river itself, where they tend to drift, with the remains of the bodies that are placed in the river. Lots of working boats, as I mentioned earlier. And one of the reasons why we have so many working boats here, not only for kind of fishing activity and moving folks around, but also for rejuvenating the wood stock or the wood supply for the cremation ceremonies. And you'll see here the green boat down on the right-hand side has piles of wood on the top of it. Typically, it takes between 600 and 900 pounds of wood to consume a body. So I mentioned before that, these funerals, these cremations are very expensive. And that's the reason why this wood, which you can see piled up throughout this photograph, has to be brought in by boat. Clearly some enormous piles of wood. You can see this chap on the left-hand side of the screen, or the kind of middle left of the screen, perched on top of that pile here. I mean, that pile has to be 20, 25 foot high. So many, many tons of wood and timber being built up at the Ghat. And then, of course, as you move back down the Ghat, you'll just see people kind of coming to life during the day, and you get a sense of the buildings, perhaps more so than you do on the evening. You certainly see the colours and the kind of sense of the accommodation that many of the folks in Varanasi are living in. And there's always someone who wants a photograph taken. Usually for a rupee or two. Certainly this chap was looking for some money. And as I mentioned, in Delhi, also a lot of begging taking place on the street itself. Those of you who were observant may have noticed before on one of the photographs around Manakarnika Ghat that the cows were meandering and kind of wandering freely amongst the funeral pyres. That's not unnatural in India for cows essentially to be allowed to roam unfettered. The Indian goddess Bhumi is represented as representative of earth and is usually shown in the form of a cow. So the cow is a very revered animal in India, and as this photograph shows, they go where they want to go and they eat and consume whatever they want to eat. So that's Varanasi. Later in the same day, we spent an hour or so at the site of Sarnath. This is a center for Buddhist learning and has been for almost 30 centuries. We saw the ruins, we saw the induction process, I guess is the right word, for trainee Buddhists. Some very serious characters here, a lot of kind of chanting and praying happening very much in the public domain, as well as the stupa. The stupa itself is a commemorative monument, and these are used to house many sacred relics. This is the site of the first Buddhist sermon in India. It was preached almost 3,000 years ago and set in place the Wheel of Dharma. I don't know whether it's just coincidence, but this Buddhist looks remarkably like the stupa. If you look at the shape of him, he looks very, very similar. So that was Sarnath. We then jumped on an airplane and went to Kajura. And Kajura is the land of the Kama Sutra. The temples here were built during the Chandela dynasty, which reached its apogee between around 900 and 1050. And the temples are set in this beautiful grassland, grass park area. And there are a group of these monuments, these temples. These are built primarily from sandstone, generally with a granite kind of foundation and then sandstone above ground. And that's what you're generally seeing when you look at these buildings. These are Hindu temples, Jain temples. The complex is a UNESCO World Heritage Site. And the temples are very much known for their erotic sculptures, hence my reference to the Kama Sutra. Historically, the site was much larger than it presents today. At one stage, the site spread over 20 square kilometers with 85 temples. Today, the site is something closer to 6 square kilometers in size with 20 temples. The temples themselves are really quite amazing. You can look at the kind of peaks, the spirals, the design, the carving. These are really, really elaborate designs. Statues, friezes, crenellations. I mean, you name it, these walls show so much about the history of India. Now, the other fascinating thing is that these temples were built without mortar. The stones are joined with simple mortar and tenon joints, and they're held in place by gravity. And obviously that means the joints themselves need to be tremendously precise. And some of the stonework, some of the individual areas of stone or the individual megaliths of stone weigh as much as 20 tons. So these are large, large buildings. And you can see here some of the kind of suggestive figures. I've missed out some of the more elaborate ones, but you can get a sense from these of the type of sculptures that are present. This is a lion, another revered animal in India. Some of these buildings were actually repaired in the 19th century, and the repair work was carried out using bricks and mortar, so not the traditional methods. And ironically, those repairs have aged more quickly than the original stonework. And where you do see them, they seem very much out of place. So in the area outside the kind of temple zone, lots of colourful activity, colourful people, camels, working camels. This is our local ice cream salesperson, or begging on the street, and also just characters hanging around in the street. So from Kajura, our next stop, and let's just flick through here. Our next stop was Orca. This is a fort complex which is built on a rocky island on the loop of the Betwa River. It's essentially a palace come fort. There are multiple of different buildings, connected buildings, which have been erected at different times on the rocky island. And again, you can get a sense of the sculpture, the architecture. It's really, really quite fascinating. This dates back to the early 16th century, 1530 or thereabouts. And it was built and named for a Murgal Emperor Jahangir, who only spent one night in the palace. And just look at the elaborate frieze work and painting material, the ceiling here. And again, combination of sandstone and marble. Really dread to think what the cost of this building would be. If you were to try and even attempt to build this building today, it would really be quite staggering. So we have the elephant again. So remember, the elephant is the representative of Lord Ganesha, and you'll notice that this elephant is missing his tusks. The tusks are a significant part of the elephant in India, and they're very symbolic. The right-hand tusk, which will be the left-hand one on this photograph, is symbolic of wisdom, and the one on the right-hand side is symbolic of emotion. So these tusks have been specifically removed in order to prevent them from being stolen or otherwise taken away. And the photographs that I showed of the elephant in Delhi, you'd notice that that also had no tusks, and I assume they have either been removed for similar reasons, to keep the animals safe, or potentially have been removed and then sold for presumably a significant value. And again, lots of colourful characters. So now the building you've all been waiting for, the Taj Mahal, the crown of the palace. It's an ivory white marble mausoleum on the southern bank of the river Yamuna in the Indian city of Agra. So this is what everyone thinks of when they think about India. Absolutely beautiful building. No other words can describe it. We were very, very fortunate to be there at sunrise. You'll see the light on this photograph is quite warm, and it really is absolutely beautiful. No other words to describe it. It was commissioned in the early 17th century by the Murgal Emperor Shah Jahan to house the tomb of his favorite wife, Mumtaz Mahal. And he himself was subsequently buried here. You can see the repair work going on one of the minarets on the right-hand side here. And I have to assume that the building is under constant repair. The building is well over almost 400 years old now. And the marble is in remarkably good condition considering the impact of pollution and the likely impact of pollution on the surface. It must be a constant challenge to keep that clean. And this is very much the area where you'll see, remember or recall those photographs of Princess Diana sitting by herself at the Taj Mahal. This is where those photographs would have been taken. And you can see again, it's very much a symmetrical building. Now, the tomb is the centerpiece of a 17-hectare or 42-acre complex. The mosque is obviously the centerpiece, if you will, but there are also guest houses and formal gardens, which are bounded by a crenellated wall on 3 sides, and then by the river on the other side. Construction was essentially finished in 1643, but other works kind of extended that for probably another 10 years or so. And the cost of the building at that stage was around 30 million rupees. In today's money, that would translate as over 1.2 billion Canadian dollars. So, a great deal of money. 20,000 people were employed to build the structures, and they were under the guidance of a board of architects. As you might imagine, it's a World Heritage Site, and it's described as the jewel of Muslim art in India and one of the universally admired masterpieces of the world's heritage. And I can well understand that. Literally everywhere you turn, you see beauty in the marble. You see the fluting on the edge of this building is absolutely perfect. This is one of the guest houses on the site, and you know, as guest houses go, that's not a bad option, it seems to me. And this looks back to the main entrance to the site itself. Now, we also took the opportunity to visit the Red Fort, which sits directly opposite to the Taj Mahal across the river. And again, we had a good opportunity to have a close-up inspection of this sandstone and the sculpture and the artistry, which was employed in building the building. And you also get a very nice view back to the Taj Mahal across the river here. Again, lots of marble, ornate marble. So the Taj Mahal is clearly one of the most attractive visitor propositions in India. And I think they calculate that somewhere between 7 and 8 million people a year visit the Taj Mahal. This was a photograph taken late in the evening, just before sunset, looking back across the river at the complex. And is it any wonder that Taj Mahal was declared a winner of the 2007 assessment of the new 7 Wonders of the World? Absolutely stunning building. So that was the Taj Mahal. Fatehpur Sikri, just down the road in Agra, built a little bit earlier than the Taj Mahal in 1569. This was the old capital of the Mughals. It's a walled city, and it encompasses a blend of Hindu as well as Islamic styles. The city didn't last for long though, only 15 years. And that was due to the scarcity of water. So they managed to build themselves a capital where there was insufficient water to feed the populace. So the site was abandoned, I guess, prior to the beginning of the 17th century. But Lord Curzon, who was a legendary conservationist, took pity, and through his efforts, the site was recovered, was rescued, was cleared, and has largely been maintained in the state that he left it in the years subsequent. So again, you see very, very beautiful, elaborate sandstone buildings. And again, lots of characters who like to have their photographs taken. We saw lots of Indian gentlemen sitting around doing very little on this holiday, as well as Gillian will testify. That seemed to be a common sight. So, where do we go to next? Well, we went to Ranthambore, the national park. This is one of the biggest and most renowned national parks in northern India. Encompasses over 1,300 square kilometers of land in Rajasthan, which is really a desert-like area to the east of Jaipur, about 130 kilometers from Jaipur. It was a former hunting ground for the Maharajas of Jaipur. And today the national park, the Ranthambore National Park, is a major wildlife tourist attraction. Many wildlife photographers and naturists and natural history lovers will come to this area, not only for the animals, but also for the landscape itself. There have been buildings and palaces within this site which have fallen very much into disrepair, but which still attract visitors today. Very interesting landscape. And lots of interesting animals. This little chimp spent 15 minutes or so entertaining all of us on our safari vehicle. I think he was practicing for some kind of dancing competition, showing us his best moves. I think we gave them 10 out of 10. I don't think his father was too impressed. He was looking a bit miserable. And I think the mom was looking even less satisfied with his behavior, but we certainly enjoyed it. So anyway, Ranthambore. Ranthambore is known for its tiger population. That's really one of the main reasons why people go to Ranthambore. It's to see the tiger. The park itself was established because of historical problems encountered with the tigers. There were many interactions between tigers and humans, which didn't work out too well for the humans, as you might imagine. So as a result, the government started a project, Project Tiger, back in the early 1970s. And initially they allotted an area of roughly 60 square miles to be a tiger sanctuary within the park, what today is the park. And that area became expanded in time. The most recent count would suggest that there are something like 71 tigers living in the park. So that's an area of 1,300 square kilometers with around 70 tigers in it. The tiger population has increased significantly. In 1982, there were roughly 40 tigers in the park. And the increase is very much down to the efforts of the government and the authorities to curb poaching. Poaching was a major problem. At one stage, the tiger population had fallen to as low as 20. So lots of effort in order to secure the population. This particular tiger is a male tiger. It's a Bengal tiger. I think it was, from memory, I think the reference number was T95 was his name or his number. All of the tigers have a name attached to them or a number attached to them, and they're tracked and followed through their lifetime. It took us 2 goes to find the tiger. We spent probably 2 or 3 hours in the morning in the safari vehicle looking for a tiger, didn't find anything. And then late in the afternoon on our second attempt, we heard this tiger and then ultimately found the tiger. The tiger is extremely noisy, I have to say, very, very noisy. You certainly know when the male is calling for the female, which is what I believe he was doing, but really quite something to see in the wild. It's not like seeing a tiger in the zoo. This is for real, and they are very large. And as you can see from this photograph, they have very big teeth and they have a great deal of purpose. There are lots of birds in the park as well. I think over 320 species of birds. This is obviously a kingfisher. Not really too sure what this is. I guess some form of magpie, and of course a heron. But anyone who's interested in birding, I'm sure, could spend a lifetime in this park. And then the fauna itself, the tree life, the scrubland itself. It's also quite beautiful to look at, quite interesting to look at. And you can see how dry it is. I mean, the ground is very, very dry, very desert-like. And even deer. So we can't talk about India without referencing farming and agriculture. Probably 50% of the employment in India is in the agriculture sector, and it accounts for almost 20% of the gross domestic product. I'm not quite sure what these guys are trying to do with this tractor. I felt a bit sorry for the tractor, but you can imagine it probably couldn't carry a great deal more than they were attempting to carry with it here. Everywhere you look, you'll see tractors and lorries on the road moving product around. This is through the park itself. And there's a constant stream, a constant convoy of vehicles and people moving the product around. India is now the world's largest supplier of rice, of cotton, sugar, and wheat, and its agricultural exports are more than twice that of the entirety of the European Union. So a massive, massive part of the economy. We had the chance to meet local villagers, very friendly, very welcoming. We met the camels that they were using to move their product around. Some of the families and the houses that they lived in. Again, you see kind of multi-generational families who would live together. This lady here, this lady is very, very friendly. She was a headmistress at a local school, and she really wanted to talk to the visitors from North America. And this is where they lived. This is part of their accommodation. Very simple, very basic. And in some ways, very embarrassing, because this is the hotel that we stayed in within the national park. And by no means is this anything like the best hotel in the park. This is pretty much par for the course as hotels go there. But you can see very much a product of the colonial era, but very, very different from that which the locals endure. So where next? Jaipur. Well, Jaipur would be the third leg of the Golden Triangle. Again, spectacular architecture. First sight in the center of Jaipur is the Hawa Mahal, or the Palace of the Winds. It's a 5-story building, and it's built like a honeycomb of a beehive. And it has 953 windows, which are called jarakas, and the breeze basically flows through the building. It keeps it cool. You can see how thin the building is. The back of the building is actually the piece on the left-hand side. The elaborate part is the back of the building, and the front of the building, the front of the palace, is on the right-hand side. But you can see how thin this building is. It's essentially one room wide. And to move amongst the upper levels, there are no stairways. You actually move up and down ramps. The building was built this way in order to allow the royal ladies to discreetly watch the grand processions in the main street, and to do so respecting purdah, which effectively means their faces were covered. They were able to look through the frieze work on the windows without using veils or covering their faces in other ways. And the building was built at the beginning of the 19th century. And that's that kind of full view. That's the kind of famous view of the Hawa Mahal. Plenty of other buildings to look at in the area which is known as the Pink City. Not all of the buildings are pink, but the majority are. The river is used, quite frankly, as a kind of refuse collection area, and these wild boars were pretty much free to roam around and enjoy whatever they could find. Some of the architecture really isn't that spectacular at all. Some of it, it certainly is air-cooled, but I'm not sure that was what they had in mind when they put the sign up. I like vehicles, especially colourful vehicles, and there are plenty of those in Jaipur. And we also had a few minutes to walk around the bazaar. You could see the coloured bangles and also some of the pottery products that were being sold. So the Fort Palace of Amber is the Kajura citadel, the capital up until the early 18th century, when the capital was subsequently moved to Jaipur. It was moved simply because they ran out of water here. It's located on the outskirts of Jaipur, and it's located on a natural ridge which overlooks the Mayota Lake. And this also is a UNESCO World Heritage Site. It was built in 1592 and took 25 years to complete. Roughly 100 elephants ply their trade here. They carry tourists up and down from the kind of main road into the fort itself. A lot of controversy around the elephants and the abuse otherwise which they receive. You see arguments both ways. Some will contend that the elephants are very well looked after, they're well exercised, well fed, well watered. Others would say that that's far from the truth. I'm really not sure. Almost embarrassed to say that we did ride on the elephant up to the fort itself. Having read about it subsequently, perhaps that's something I would think twice about. But anyway, very colourful, and certainly nice to see the elephants. We'll just spend a few minutes. I'll get my voice back and I'll just show you a few of the design elements of the building, and then we'll come back and explore the heart of Jaipur itself. So we'll just go radio silent for about a minute or so, and then I'll come back and join you. Now, as you might imagine, this is a full-time preservation experience, and we were able to watch one of the artisans at work preserving some of the fretwork and the silver work which is embedded into the walls of the structure, the walls of the palace. And lots of cleaning activity also taking place. And again, just some of the detail of the architecture, which I actually found really quite fascinating to look at. This gentleman is playing a sitar, which is a traditional Indian instrument. Many different variants. This appears to be a kind of bamboo one. If you kind of look at the top, there appears to be a hole running through the wood. I'm pretty sure this is bamboo. And anyone who's been to China will recognize the similarity with the Great Wall of China here. They don't appear to have let the mountain get in the way of building the wall. So as I said, we'll then go back into the heart of Jaipur itself, and we'll just spend a few minutes looking at what's called the Jantar Mantar Observatory. And this was built in the early 1700s by a great warrior astronomy. The city itself owes its name to that warrior, Jai Singh. The observatory has 16 instruments. They're all mathematical instruments in the form of giant sculptures. And these are used to measure all sorts of things. They can measure time, they can measure the temperature, how hot they can predict from readings from these instruments how hot the summer months will be. They can estimate the date of arrival, the duration and the intensity of the monsoon, and the possibility of floods and famine. And I think these concepts are very much built on India's tradition when it comes to mathematics. Indian mathematicians have made many contributions to the study of mathematics. They're responsible for the concept of zero as a number, of negative numbers, of arithmetic, of algebra, trigonometry, so sines and cosines and tans, all those things you didn't like doing at school. They were all developed in India. And I suspect that many of those learnings have been applied in building this park. It really is quite a spectacular park itself. Someone's not on mute there, by the way. The park itself is attached to the City Palace Museum. This is a gold etching at the City Palace Museum. The City Palace Museum is still home to the Jaipur royal family. You can see very, very grand architecture again, very beautiful. I think it was actually a wedding ceremony taking place here after we left the building. There are a number of historical gateways within the palace. This is the Peacock Gate, and that's dedicated to Lord Vishnu, and it represents autumn. I think there are 4 gates, each of which represent a different season. And I assume this chap was in place to provide security for the royal family. So that's India for the time being. Let's have a quick step into, let's just quickly flick through these transport pictures. We're a bit tight on time. Let's move to Kathmandu and Nepal specifically, or Nepal with Kathmandu specifically. So Kathmandu is the capital of Nepal. It's got a population of just over 2.5 million people. It is and has been for many years the center of Nepal's history, its art, its culture, and its economy. It is very much a multi-ethnic population with a Hindu and a Buddhist majority. So roughly 3 kilometers west of Kathmandu is Swayambhu, and that's one of the holiest Buddha stupas in Nepal. And this is said to have evolved spontaneously when the valley was created out of a primordial lake more than 2,000 years ago. The stupa itself, which is this building, is the oldest of its kind in Nepal. And as you saw, there are many shrines and monasteries and other kind of artifacts and buildings around it. And you can see the prayer flags there hanging, and you'll see those all over Nepal. The monkeys are also a problem here, and they certainly attack and are interested in tourists and taking from the tourists whatever they can. One of the highlights of our visits to Kathmandu were the tours to the Durbar squares. There are 3 of the squares, and they're each located next to a royal palace. Now, unfortunately, many of these buildings were heavily damaged in the earthquake of 2015, and you see evidence of that in this photograph here. And unfortunately, lots of the buildings you're going to see photographs of are in this condition today. A magnitude 7.8 earthquake struck Nepal in 2015. It toppled the majority of the multi-story buildings in Kathmandu. It created landslides, it created avalanches in the mountains. Over 9,000 people were killed and 22,000 injured. And it was the worst earthquake that they'd suffered in almost 100 years. And unfortunately, the earthquake, the main earthquake itself, was followed by over 100 aftershocks. And then 17 days later, there was another major earthquake, this time a 7.3 earthquake on the Richter scale. So a third of the national population were affected by those earthquakes. And as a result, many buildings and many livelihoods have been destroyed, but some buildings have survived. You get a sense from this photograph, the shape of the building. The building is no longer kind of linear. You'll see that, you know, the ends are kind of falling in, that the horizontal beams are no longer horizontal. Hundreds of thousands of people lost everything, and they faced extreme poverty. 600,000 homes were destroyed, and a further third of a million were damaged in the 14 worst districts. Nepal enjoys a per capita income of roughly $1,000. So it's one of the poorest economies in the world anyway. So you can imagine the impact that the earthquake has had on the economy. Nepal relied very heavily on tourism for its economy. And unfortunately, as a result of the earthquake, many people stopped coming to Nepal. At the time of our visit in 2017, which was 2 years after the earthquake, essentially no Americans had come to Nepal since the earthquake. Essentially, the workers or the locals have been left to fend for themselves in terms of repairing the damage. So it is literally every man for themselves. As you walk around the streets, you'll see families rebuilding their own houses, men and women together doing that work. Many of the temples, which in themselves are UNESCO World Heritage Sites, have been destroyed or almost destroyed. And you have the sense that if another earthquake were to hit, that many of these buildings would just simply collapse into the ground, and they would never be seen again. And many attempts have been made to catalogue the kind of artifacts from those buildings. So they're trying to preserve them, secure them, and get them ready to be returned to their rightful place when the buildings are reconstructed. But you have to imagine this is going to take many, many years to restore. This is very much in line with Buddhist artwork that you would see in Nepal and Tibet, in China, in other countries. The same kind of vibrant colors, the reds, the ochres, the yellows. And likewise, the symbolism in the figures, would be repeated in those other Asian countries. you just have to imagine how spectacular this might have looked prior to the earthquake. Swayambhunath Temple is located on the banks of the river in Kathmandu, and this is known as Little Varanasi. So we saw Varanasi during our stop in India, 40,000 cremations or thereabouts a year. This is very much of a similar vein, just on a very, very different scale, but the same kind of tradition in terms of the burning ceremony. And what you're actually seeing here is the beginning of a cremation. And this is very much done in the public domain. This is a little vignette of the largest stupa in Nepal, just outside of Tibet. And I mentioned tourism before. Tourism historically has been a major part of the economy for Nepal. So vendors, traders, very keen to sell their products or give you a ride in their kind of tricycle carriage. And these are some of the powders that are used in the religious ceremonies and in the colouring of the statues and the artifacts. Those of you who are familiar with the Buddhist culture will recognize the mandala. The mandala is Sanskrit for circle. It's a geometric design that holds a great deal of symbolism for both Buddhist and Hindu cultures, and is believed to represent different aspects of the universe. And it's used in the process of meditation and prayer. So, Everest. So this was a big build-up for us on this trip. We missed out on the first day. We were seeking to fly over Everest or to the side of Everest at sunrise. And on our first day, the atmosphere was so misty that it really was unsafe to fly. And we sat at the airport for a couple of hours and then left the airport, very disappointed. These are paintings of the mountains that the locals have made. But on the second day, the air was much clearer. You can still get a sense of the haziness in this photograph. But we turned up at the airport at 5 o'clock in the morning, and were presented with this sight. This is a British Airways or British Aerospace Jetstream aircraft. It was actually made in the UK, which was nice for me. Operated by Yeti Airlines. So this was the aircraft that we flew over Everest in. And there is Everest itself. That's taken from the cockpit window. We were each allowed literally 15, 20 seconds to go into the cockpit of the aircraft. And it just so happened that my turn came just as we reached the kind of zenith of our flight and were just about to turn back and head back to the airport. So I was fortunate to take this photograph from the cockpit window just at the point at which Everest came into view. So you all know about Everest, scaled in 1953 by Sir Edmund Hillary and Tenzing Norgay Sherpa. What you might not know about Sir Edmund Hillary, maybe one or two of you have shared this fact with before, not only was Hillary the first individual to summit Everest, he was also the first individual to claim that he reached the summit of Everest, the South and the North Poles. And that last feat was particularly interesting. He only achieved that in 1985, the North Pole, and he flew there with Neil Armstrong, the astronaut, Steve Fossett, who was the first person to fly a balloon around the world, and Patrick Morrow, who was the first person to climb the highest peak of all 7 continents. So quite an august group, but certainly quite an achievement from Sir Edmund. And you know, his likes perhaps won't be seen again. But anyway, that was Everest. We kind of turned around, flew back again, and enjoyed a glass of champagne in our seats on the aircraft as we enjoyed the landscape beneath the Himalayas. And obviously, this was really quite something quite spectacular. Then just a few parting shots of the locals in Nepal. As I've already said, you know, a very, very resilient group of people, but also extremely friendly and welcoming. We were actually welcomed into the house of one young family, and Gillian and I had a meal with the family, and we were made extremely welcome. Really very down to earth, very giving people, and we thoroughly enjoyed ourselves in Nepal and would go back in a heartbeat. So we'll finish a tour in Darjeeling. So we're now back in India. Now, if you recall the map on the first page, Darjeeling was just to the right or just to the east of Nepal and Kathmandu. And you would think it was a matter of a moment to fly from Darjeeling to Nepal. That couldn't be farther from the truth. We had to fly from Darjeeling all the way back to Delhi, and then from Delhi all the way back to Calcutta, which is to the east of Darjeeling, and then back again to Darjeeling. So it really felt like we'd spent a day or almost 2 days traveling, when in fact we could have traveled much more directly and much more quickly between Nepal and Darjeeling. But anyway, that's how it worked out. But the trip was well worthwhile. Darjeeling, obviously famous for its tea, but also famous for its railway. The Darjeeling Himalayan Railway, the DHR, is a narrow gauge railway, toy railway, which runs for 50 miles. And there's another UNESCO World Heritage Site. The regular passenger trains which run on the railway are diesel powered, such as this vehicle here, or this train here. And there are 6 of those diesel vehicles, but they also have around about a dozen steam powered trains. And that's what the tourists use. That's what we enjoyed our trip on, was the steam train. And these trains all date back to the late 19th century, early 20th century. They're built in Glasgow in the UK and were brought out here by the British Army as they developed the railway system. Darjeeling itself was formed in the early 19th century by the British. It was the site of a sanatorium for invalid servants of the East India Company. The town was laid out in around about 1840, and a road was built between Sikkim and Darjeeling, and that road ultimately morphed into the railway line that we have today, and a new road was built. The railway line itself kind of winds its way through the town of Darjeeling, and it shares space with pedestrians and with regular passenger cars and trucks. So you've got to be very careful as you move around Darjeeling not to get run over by a steam train or a diesel train. And these trains are lovingly cared for. You know, literally hundreds of workers pouring over the trains when we were there, oiling them and getting them fired up for the day's work. This is where we stayed in Darjeeling. And Darjeeling itself sits roughly 7,000 feet above sea level, and it looks out into the Himalayas. So really quite a spectacular setting for the town itself. This photograph of some of the local landscape taken from the hotels kind of hints at some of the issues that are being faced by the populace in Darjeeling As you can see, the ground itself is very dry. Where it's irrigated, you can see the green, but otherwise the soil is extremely dry. And Darjeeling has suffered from droughts now for probably the last 15 or 20 years. Certainly since the turn of the century, Darjeeling has experienced severe drought conditions. Tenzing Norgay Sherpa, obviously a son of Darjeeling. It's unclear strictly where he was born, but obviously famous for partnering Hillary to the summit of Everest. He's certainly buried here. There's some doubt as to whether he was born in Nepal or actually born in Tibet, and history is a little bit murky on that, as indeed it is on his age. However, what's not murky is that the Himalayan Mountaineering Institute was established in Darjeeling as testimony to his efforts in climbing Mount Everest with Hillary, and he was responsible for running that institute for many years, and that's been responsible for training many climbers, from all around the world. As I say, he's buried here, and there's a plaque and a statue here, which was unveiled by Sir Edmund Hillary to commemorate that. We were fortunate to visit the Tibetan Refugee Self-Help Centre, where local handicrafts are made. As I mentioned, the economy here is a very, very poor economy. And we also visited the Goom Monastery, another kind of Buddhist center. These are prayer wheels, incidentally. You've seen a few of these already. And then there's a very active local bazaar or food market. So I've got a few photographs here of some of the food on display, and it's all very kind of open and there for you to put your hands in. Not sure how hygienic it is, but it does look pretty good. And as I said, the folks there are all very, very friendly and very keen for you to try their wares. So our last stop on the trip was the Tukva Tea Estate. Many of the tea estates were established by the British in the mid-19th century. Dr. Campbell was a pioneering British tea planter. He was responsible for establishing this tea plant, which was built in 1852. And many of the processes and equipment items that you see there today are exactly the same as they were then. Certainly there's kind of different power systems running them now, but the basic mechanics of the systems are exactly the same. And as you see, there's no tea actually being produced at the time of our visit. I mentioned before the drought conditions. Unfortunately, since the turn of the century, many of the years have experienced drought in Darjeeling. And as a result of that, the crop is beginning to fail. The yield has fallen by 20% since the turn of the century. And as you can see here, much of the land is dry, and they're struggling to irrigate it. When the rain comes, it's more inclined to wash the plants away, wash the soil away if it comes in a deluge. So rather than there being a kind of constant soaking, it's coming as a deluge. The tea plants themselves, in many cases, they are the original tea plants. They're 150 years old or more. And the drought conditions have weakened the tea plants, the tea bushes. And as a result, many of the tea plants have suffered from pest attacks, things like red spider mite, tea mosquito, and blister blight. So from an economy standpoint, this is not good news for Darjeeling. We were able to walk through the plantations and see the ladies, generally it's ladies picking the tea leaves. And this was the start of the season for them. And they were very pleased to show us what they were collecting. And these fields are laid out, really quite, I mean, they're a lovely place to be, and very colourful. Just to give you a sense, within Darjeeling, there are roughly 400 individual tea gardens, probably 80 tea plantations themselves, and they yield something of the order of 8,000 metric tons of Darjeeling tea each year. As I say, that's well down from its peak. The other challenge which is being faced is that of remuneration for the workers here. Shortly after we left Darjeeling, and nothing to do with us, I promise, the workers went on strike. There are around 400,000 people employed in picking tea and the tea processes within Darjeeling, or the area of Darjeeling, and they went on strike for 3 days. And the reason why they were striking was their reward, or lack thereof. They're paid roughly $2.5 Canadian a day to work in the gardens, and they were demanding a 20% pay rise. They wanted $3 a day for that activity. So when you buy a tea in town, just think about that: $3 a day to pick it, and you're buying a box of Tetley for $5. It somehow doesn't seem right. So let's end on a high note. So these two young ladies were clearly very happy to see the tourists, two nice smiley ladies, and very much kind of illustrative of the welcome that we received, quite frankly, wherever we went. In India, whether it would be India or Nepal, we were never made to feel less than welcome. And we certainly felt safe at all times, very, very comfortable. So I'm going to end it there. I'll say thank you for tuning in. Hopefully that wasn't too long. I know there was a lot of material to get through. I hope that you enjoyed it, that you've learned a little bit about India, some things that you didn't know, and Nepal that you didn't know before you came tonight. And who knows, perhaps you'll feel motivated to give it a go and take a visit there one day. I would certainly go back in a heartbeat, both to India and to Nepal, and hopefully I'll get to do that.
I always thought that India and Nepal was a very poor, and the poverty would be very depressing. How did Mike and Gillian find that?
Thanks, Graham. My sense, probably naively, but my sense would be that people simply lived through it. I think they've enjoyed their family life. Family was extremely important for certainly the individuals that we met with. I think they were all very proud of what they were achieving, both as a country and as individuals. I think religion plays a massive part in both countries to the way society works. Quite frankly, in India, I'm always credulous that somehow you can take a population of 1.3 billion people and broadly move them all in the same direction. With multiple religions and multiple layers of government, somehow the country stays together and moves together. I think that's, quite frankly, amazing. I think there is a strong sense of history. I think respect for the land. That was very strong in Nepal, I have to say. I mean, from an environmental perspective, those guys were really respectful of what they had. Very concerned about things like global warming. And Darjeeling, it was kind of real in India. They saw very much the impact of the drought through the last 20 years and the impact it was having on the economy. So very much an awareness of kind of world issues, world factors. But no, I genuinely think, people kind of see through it. I think there's a high level of ambition. I mean, I had the benefit of working in India I've been to India on many occasions for work reasons as well as for pleasure. And I often had a sense of everyone striving to do their very best and wanting to be better. And, maybe that's what helps to move the country along. There is a great deal of ambition, but there is a great deal of, of poverty at the side. And some of the things that you see around the poverty are really quite horrible. we saw people begging, but we also saw people begging who were missing limbs, for example. And we were told that, you know, they were missing limbs because those limbs had been removed by their parents in many cases, in order to allow those individuals to be put out to act, you know, to beg and to look for money that way, which is incredibly sad. I mean, it's horrible, at least to someone from our environment, our culture. So no, I couldn't pretend to understand everything around the culture, but what I did understand, I really enjoyed and really respected.
Okay, here we go. Can you hear me now?
It sounds like Mike.
Yes, it is Mike. How are you? Good.
I'm good, thanks.
Good to see you. Okay, one thing I noticed when you were showing them photos of the mosque in Delhi and also on the Red Fort, there looked like there was a Jewish Star of David symbols above the door on two photos. And I'm just wondering, is that some sort of a symbol that would mean something in the Muslim culture, or?
I don't know a definitive answer, Mike. I think the answer would likely be yes. I mean, you certainly see other symbols being used. You know, what we would refer to as the swastika is
Yes.
very much used in that culture and predates, you know, any use by, you know, the Germans or Nazis or you know, Europeans. I suspect it's pretty much the same with the, you know, what you would refer to perhaps as the Star of David. You're right, I did notice it on a number of buildings, but I didn't research to understand, you know, the symbolism per se. As you rightly say, though, it was present certainly on many of the mosque type buildings, so it would suggest it had an Islamic connotation, but I can't profess to know exactly what the linkage is.
Okay.
Just to say, that was an excellent presentation. The photographs were amazing and very, very interesting. So thank you very much.
And thanks, Graham.
Thank you, Hannah. And thank you, Michael, for a very superb presentation. This has been an inspiring and educational journey with you. The amazing photographs and the insightful commentary have really allowed us to get to know another people and their way of life and their culture. And that's what these sessions are all about. I know that you have spent a lot of time preparing, and we really appreciate not only that time, but also your expertise in taking these amazing photographs. So thank you again. We'll look forward to another presentation.
Thanks, Graham. Thank you.